Welcome back to Boyd Book Club, and this week in our Osinga Science, Strategy, and War, we are going to be reviewing Chapter 3, discussing sort of the scientific frameworks behind Boyd's thinking and Boyd's development. Osinga offers up here that so much of understanding Boyd is rooted in understanding this changing zeitgeist, or the changing sensibility and sense surrounding science at the time of Boyd's reading, writing, and creation. Chapter 3 and Chapter 4 form a two-part discussion of so much related to this topic of science and how it relates to Boyd's evolving and understanding thinking about strategy, human nature, decision-making, and everything that's at the core of his work. So much like last week when we introduced the notion of dialectical thinking and how that emerges in many ways from Hegel's notions of reasoning, this week I want to talk a little bit about some of the philosophical underpinnings that predate the science and philosophical concepts that Boyd is going to be dealing with, treating with in his writing and creation. This takes us back to two critical and important philosophical thinkers, David Hume and Immanuel Kant. Hence the joke. So Hume is principally an empiricist. Hume's philosophical project in the mid-1700s is to discuss human nature at its core in a scientific way. Hume maintains that we need to, quote, reject every system, however subtle or ingenious, which is not founded on fact and observation, end quote. In this way, Hume is sort of the father of what is known as the analytic school of philosophy. And the analytic school of philosophy is empiricist driven. It is driven based upon the notion of deductive reasoning, deductive logic, where we can only obtain answers to propositions through the information that is contained within the proposition or series of propositions that we put together. Hume's work is the beginning of what is really modern neuroscience and cognitive science in many, many respects. It's the drive that we ought to be able to find causal mechanisms for human thinking. And in this way, Hume's work gives us a foundation for moving away from a grossly, quote-unquote, metaphysical project and into one where human reasoning, human morality, human logic is rooted in observable causal action. Often placed in contrast to Hume is Kant. Kant's most widely known, widely discussed, and perhaps most difficult book is his Critique of Pure Reason, written directly in response to much of what Hume has brought to the table. It is, in many respects, Kant attempting to struggle with this empiricist and analytic problem that he sees. In the Critique of Pure Reason, what Kant sets out to do is say something to the effect of, well, it's not so simple as that. It's not so simple as being able to see direct causal connections in human thought, in human understanding, in the way the mind works, in the way morality works. And one of the things that Kant postulates in direct contrast to Hume is this notion of synthetic a priori knowledge. Synthetic a priori knowledge is realistically the complete opposite of analytic or empirical knowledge. It is synthetic, it is creative knowledge that comes without previous experience. So a common expression that is used to explain this is the idea that all bodies are heavy. Heavy is a concept, is a postulate that does not exist in any of the previous propositions in that statement. And therefore, if we break the notion of all bodies being a set of things, nowhere within that set of things, bodies, is this conceptual notion of heaviness. Therefore, to bring these two things together and form a true whole requires some sort of synthetic process based upon that occurs absent experience with this proposition. Now, this concept of a priori knowledge is one that I think Kant spends a lot of time on, but it's one I'm not dead set on. I'm going to be honest. It's one that I keep thinking about and coming back to, and the limits of what we can truly describe as a priori knowledge. And that's something that we're going to get into heavily when we begin discussing the OODA loop explicitly, and where, in my thinking, the Kant's reasoning about a priori can break down a little bit. So what we need to recognize is that Boyd's work in particular comes out of a discussion, a dialectic of sorts that is continually happening between Hume and Kant from the late 1700s, when the Critique of Pure Reason is published, all the way forward, even to modern day. There remains what is known as the analytic versus continental divide. Trust me, that says continental divide in philosophy, which really forces Kant and Hume into an ongoing discussion and debate. Coming back then to Osinga's work in particular, Osinga spends a good deal of time discussing what I refer to as Boyd's Trinity. That would be Werner Heisenberg, Kurt Gödel, that's an umlaut, and the second law of thermodynamics. So we want to take a second and just briefly review Heisenberg's work, Gödel's work, and the second law to see how these kind of all tie together as part of Boyd's thinking. So central to Heisenberg's work in its application to Boyd is what's known as the indeterminacy principle. You guys are going to make me learn how to spell. The indeterminacy principle is rooted in the notion that it's often also referred to as the uncertainty principle. And what that is directly related to is that if I am observing a subatomic particle, I can know where it is, or I can know how fast it's going. But I cannot know both. The reason for this is that as I gain greater certainty about position, I decrease certainty about the speed at which I'm moving. Because eventually, in order to capture a completely accurate picture of a location, a fixed location, a snapshot of a location, I have to reduce this object down to zero motion. Conversely, if I want to know exactly how fast this object is going, then I begin to lose positional certainty. Think about saying, as you are driving your car, how fast you're going and where you're at. If you say that you are going exactly 60 miles an hour, you cannot say with any degree of precision where you are because you're constantly moving. So this indeterminacy and uncertainty principle is something that fascinates Boyd. Couple that with Kurt Gödel's work on incompleteness. Kurt Gödel is a mathematician who comes up with a very simple notion that axiomatic systems, mathematical systems, cannot be proven from within their own set of axioms. We must look outside of the axiomatic system in question in order to prove or disprove its validity. This means that any system of explanation is inherently incomplete. Within our own reasoning, within our own thinking, as we will see it manifest in orientation as we get into the OODA loop, as it will manifest in orientation, our orientation cannot be proven or disproven within this concept. It requires the input of outside information in order for us to assess the conclusions that we are reaching. So, we have this uncertainty or indeterminacy principle, which says that we cannot have perfect knowledge of all conditions of a system. We have the incompleteness theorem, which says that no system can be fully explained only using postulates and axioms that are contained within it, that we must look outside the system to validate its conclusions. And finally, we have the second law of thermodynamics. The second law of thermodynamics, I always like the image of a coffee cup to illustrate this. Last week we talked about entropy. And entropy is the inevitable process, the inevitable outcome of the second law of thermodynamics. What the second law of thermodynamics states is that all systems, all closed systems, proceed from an orderly state to a disorderly state over time, that they become equalized. So if we think about the coffee cup, the coffee that we have put in our cup, we can see it steaming here. The coffee in our cup comes out of the pot hot. It has had energy put into it. Its molecules are moving around. Once that energy is no longer being put into the cup, there is no longer the cup sitting on a burner. Now the energy in this cup is going to be dissipated because of a couple of things. First, the first law of thermodynamics, which says that heat moves from areas of energy moves from areas of high concentration to low concentration. The room around this cup is a lower concentration of energy, and therefore it will be giving its heat off into the room. That law of heat transfer is important, but what's more important in the context of Boyd's work is the notion that the energized state here, because it is not being maintained, heat is a byproduct of energy. It is not the product of energy, it's a byproduct of energy. And therefore, this heat is going to diffuse, because of the first law of thermodynamics, and become less usable. It is going into a waste process, and that waste process is its transfer to heating the rest of the room. Because this cup of coffee cannot increase the heat in the room sufficiently to do any valuable work. It is really just being wasted. So all of this energy is being wasted, proceeding to a disorderly state. That is entropy. What becomes important here is to use this coffee cup analogy to think about the difference between a coffee cup giving off its heat into the room and a coffee cup sitting on a little warming tray. And this little electric warming tray puts energy into the coffee cup. That makes the coffee cup an open system. There is energy coming in, there is energy going out. It is an open system. This coffee cup here, the coffee cup off the hot plate, is a closed system. It is a system in which no inputs from the outside world are being received. No energy is being received. The work, the thinking that happens here is going to become so immensely critical to understanding Boyd's thinking. So this brings us in chapter 3 of Osinga's work to discussing 4 thinkers who are critical to Boyd's understanding directly. And that is Karl Popper, Michael Polanyi, I believe I'm saying that right, Jean Piaget, and Thomas Kuhn. The work of these 4 individuals plays a direct role in helping develop Boyd's thinking. Karl Popper is best known as being the advocate for the concept of falsifiability, the notion that any hypothesis that is worthy the name is falsifiable, that it can be determined whether or not it is in fact false. And falsification is the idea that we can never necessarily obtain truth. We may never be able to obtain pure fact, but that what we can do is analyze, assess, and determine whether or not a hypothesis can be falsified. And it is through the aggregate of failing to falsify hypotheses that we determine that they are in fact true. We always remain open to the fact that they could be falsified at some point, that evidence could emerge that falsifies our belief and would force us to change that belief, but also that as technological or philosophical changes occur that allow us to examine a hypothesis in a new or novel way, that we may determine that it is in fact false by virtue of the scale that we look at it. So in contrast to Popper, we have what I refer to as the Parcae. And the Parcae for Boyd are three individuals, this Michael Polanyi, Jean Piaget, Thomas Kuhn. The Parcae are directly the Roman analogs to the Greek fates, who spin the structures that form the underlying nature by which life itself can exist in that mythological system. So for Boyd, I refer to these individuals as the Parcae because I believe their thinking, their work, forms the undercurrent that allows so much of Boyd's work to emerge and happen. In Michael Polanyi, we see the discussion of the concepts of emergent properties versus pure reductionism come into play. And this, to me, is really a process of working through the difference in the empiric versus synthetic camp, right? Anything, any property or process that is emergent is ultimately synthetic. It cannot be determined purely through a reductionist evaluation of initial conditions, and we can only work it backwards. We cannot predict emergence in a forward-looking manner. And it is from Polanyi that Boyd is exposed to the thinking of an individual like Hegel. Again, there is nothing explicitly in Boyd's references, and in having discussed this with Chet Richards and Chuck Spinney, they have no recollection of Boyd discussing Hegelian dialectics, the notion of synthesis as the emergence of a new concept. This does not come directly to Boyd from Hegel, nor does Kant's thinking come directly to Boyd from Hegel. They come by way of Polanyi. Polanyi is the vehicle by which Boyd begins to see these concepts in a philosophical, humanistic type light. Following Polanyi, we have two other individuals. We have Jean Piaget and Thomas Kuhn. Jean Piaget is principally a psychologist. He is principally a thinker about human development. One of the things that Piaget talks about that helps inform so much of Boyd's thinking, not only is his work on human development, but his work on structuralism. Piaget wants to understand the structures of human thought, human action, and where human development comes from, how systems play into the way we look at the world, the way we view the world. The third individual here that matters is Thomas Kuhn. And Thomas Kuhn is best known for a book called The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. And in it, he postulates this idea of paradigm shifts. Paradigm shifts are when we hit a place in our development, our evolutionary development of a theory, a philosophy, a scientific practice, where the prevailing wisdom suddenly becomes invalidated. Perhaps not falsified, but invalidated, because we see that there are new and interesting ways to look at information, to look at the world around us. And what happens in these paradigm shifts is that we go from a very static process of examining science to a whole new way of examining it. Paradigm shifts are an emergent property in contrast to existing structural foundations. When we take these three individuals, they are in so many respects offering a discussion that is very contrary to Popper's work, because Popper's work ultimately is rooted in this falsification theory and therefore does not allow for emergent properties in the same sense. Polanyi, Piaget, Kuhn all offer us up a thought process that allows for the synthetic, the emergent, to come into play. And this is going to be critical to Boyd's thinking and understanding Boyd. So as we bring chapter 3 to a close, what we want to recognize is that Osinga is giving us a starting point for understanding the conceptual schemes that are shaping Boyd's thinking throughout the late 60s, 70s, 80s, and even into the early 90s. And that understanding the explicit references to uncertainty, incompleteness, and entropy is vital, but we also need to understand sort of the implicit backdrop that is occurring in Boyd's thinking and his understanding related to structuralism, paradigms, and systems. Because this right here is what truly underlies, is the girdering system beneath orientation in the OODA loop. Yes, the Trinity of Heisenberg, Gödel, and the second law of thermodynamics run on the surface throughout Boyd's work. But when we go back and we read Destruction and Creation, we will see there the underlying structure that, once again, is foundational to so much of what will come next. So, I hope this helps paint a little bit of a clearer picture on some of the thinkers that are being discussed in chapter 3 and how they may interplay and interwork with Boyd. Chapter 4 is going to get into complexity and chaos theory, which is also critical, but comes after, it comes on the heels of all of this work that's come before it. So these empiricist versus synthetic notions that we're discussing, the work that has been done by the 7 thinkers that we've sort of discussed today is all really, really important. It is worth your time. If you want to understand Boyd's work on a much deeper level, I would argue that it is important that you take time and go in and read these thinkers yourself. Have your own conversation with their works. Try to see where Boyd is coming from. I think a lot of it's worth your time, and we're going to get into some of this material as we go through this Boyd Book Club project. So, again, thank you to all of you who are Patreons for your support in helping make these videos possible. Please like, share, subscribe. Check out the other work that is going on over on the Patreon page, over at the Fire Service Warrior Facebook page, on the Fire Service Warrior website and YouTube channel, as well as the work that Sean and I are doing with Adult Academy and No Filter Fitness. You can find all of this information in 1,000 different places. We'll talk to you soon. See you next week. Cheers.